"Can I eat your leftovers?" a homeless girl asked a billionaire. And in that moment, everything changed. The bag was right there. It was sitting on a wooden bench outside the glass tower, still warm, the smell of garlic and noodles drifting toward Maya Reyes like a cruel joke. She had been awake for 31 hours. Her shoes had a split along the left sole that let cold air in with every step. She had not eaten anything real in 2 days, and by real she meant something that required chewing, something that came in a container, and not from a half-empty packet she had found near a bus stop. She did not reach for the bag. That was the thing about Maya that most people would never understand. She was 17 years old, sitting on concrete outside one of the most expensive buildings in the city, and she did not reach for something that did not belong to her. She had rules. They were the only things she had managed to keep. The man who had set the bag down was still there, about 10 feet away, pacing in small, tight circles the way people do when a phone call is not going the way they want it to go. He was wearing a dark suit, the kind that does not wrinkle, the kind that costs more than what most people make in a month. He was not looking at the bag. He was not looking at anything, except the middle distance where people stare when they are thinking very hard about something that has nothing to do with the street they are standing on. Maya watched him. She watched the bag. She watched the hundreds of people moving past her on the sidewalk, the river of shoes and briefcases and coat hems, and nobody, not a single person looking down. That was what 6 months of living outside had taught her. Not how to survive in the ways people imagined, not where to sleep or how to stay warm, but something simpler and far heavier. She had learned that most people had developed a specific kind of vision that allowed them to look directly at her and see nothing. It was not cruelty. It was practice. The city had taught them the same way the city had taught her, just different lessons. She had been invisible for so long that speaking felt like something she had to remember how to do. The way you remember how to ride a bicycle after years without one, your body uncertain for a moment before the muscle memory returns. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. She said, "Excuse me, can I eat your leftovers?" The man stopped pacing. He did not turn immediately. There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, and in those seconds Maya became aware of her own heartbeat in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the fact that she had just spoken out loud to a stranger for the first time in 4 days. He turned. He was older than she had guessed from a distance, 50, maybe a little past it, with gray coming in at his temples and lines around his eyes that came from either a lot of laughter or a lot of hard thinking, and she could not tell yet which one. He had a strong face, not a pretty face, the kind of face that had been tested by something at some point, and had held. He looked at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. That alone was enough to make her breath catch. Most people, when they finally noticed her, did one of two things. They looked away immediately, guilty and efficient, like they had seen something they were not supposed to see. Or they looked too long, studying her the way people study an accident, with a mix of relief and discomfort that was somehow worse than being ignored. He did neither. He just looked at her the way a person looks at another person. His name was Daniel Holt, though she did not know that yet. She did not know that the glass tower behind her bore his company's name on the 14th floor. She did not know that he had 3 cars and a house in 2 cities, and a personal assistant who managed his grocery deliveries. She did not know any of that. She just knew he was not looking away. He said, "When did you last eat?" She had expected him to say no. She had expected him to pick up the bag and walk away, which would have been fine, which would have been the expected outcome, the outcome she had already made peace with before the words left her mouth. She had not expected a question. She said, "Yesterday, kind of." He looked at the bag on the bench, then he looked back at her. Something moved across his face that she could not name. He picked up the bag and walked toward her. She did not move. She had learned not to move toward people when they were coming to her. Moving toward people could be misread. It could change the situation in ways she did not have the energy to manage. He stopped about 2 feet away. He held out the bag. She took it. He did not walk away. He looked at the concrete beside her, just for a moment, the way a person looks at a chair, to see if it is clean before sitting in it. Then he sat down, not on the bench 3 feet away, on the concrete, right there, his expensive trousers on the same ground she had been sitting on. She opened the bag. Pad thai. Mostly full, still warm. There were napkins folded inside, and a plastic fork still in its wrapper. She unwrapped the fork with hands that she tried to keep steady. She ate. He did not watch her eat. He looked at the street, at the river of people still moving past, and she was grateful for that. When she was halfway through the container, she said, "You didn't have to sit down." He said, "I know." Those two words settled something in her she had not known was unsettled. He was not sitting there because he felt sorry for her. Or maybe he did. But that was not the only reason. She had met people who felt sorry for her. They looked at her differently. They talked a little too softly. The way people talk to someone who is sick, he was not doing that. She kept eating. A cab honked somewhere half a block away. The wind came between the buildings and moved a paper cup along the gutter in small skipping motions. He said, "What's your name?" She said, "Maya." He said, "I'm Daniel." Not his last name, not his title, just Daniel. She did not know yet that she would remember that detail for the rest of her life. She did not know that one day she would tell this story to someone she loved, and that the part she would return to, the part she would say mattered, was not the food or the help that came later. It was the fact that he said just Daniel, on a concrete sidewalk, like they were two people meeting at a normal place, under normal circumstances. She finished the pad thai. She folded the container closed and put it back in the bag, because she had rules. He said, "Are you hungry for something hot?" She looked at him. He said, "There's a diner around the corner. Coffee, soup, whatever you want. I'm buying." She had been offered things before. Help came in different shapes. Some of it left her feeling smaller than before she received it, the way a gift can sometimes carry the weight of what the giver needs you to feel about them. She had learned to read the shape of an offer quickly. She read this one. She said, "Okay." She stood up. He stood up beside her, and said nothing about the fact that her jacket had a tear across the back shoulder, or that her shoes made a faint slapping sound on the pavement as she walked. He just walked beside her at her pace, not ahead, not steering her with a hand on her shoulder the way people sometimes did when they thought they were being helpful. They walked around the corner and into the diner, which was warm and smelled of coffee and frying butter, and a waitress in soft shoes looked at them both without blinking and handed them menus. Maya ordered soup and pancakes and orange juice. She watched his face when the waitress wrote it down. He did not flinch. She thought about that, about how small a thing it was, the absence of a flinch, and how much it told her. Outside, the city continued its movement, thousands of people passing the spot where she had been sitting, none of them knowing that on that particular Tuesday afternoon, on that particular stretch of concrete, the first word of a new chapter had been written in the smallest possible voice. "Excuse me." 3 syllables. And something had shifted that neither of them could name yet, but that both of them, in their separate ways, were already beginning to feel. Daniel Holt had a 4:30 meeting he was going to miss. He knew it by the time they sat down in the corner booth, and he sent a single message to his assistant that said push the 4:30 and put his phone face down on the table, which was something he almost never did. His phone was his lifeline. His assistant called it the thing that kept 37 employees and 4 active contracts and 2 overseas partnerships running at the correct speed. Putting it face down on a diner table was the kind of thing that made his assistant slightly anxious. He did it anyway. Maya noticed. She noticed everything. 6 months on the street had not taken much from her, but it had given her that, a quality of attention that most people lose by the time they finish school. She saw things in the framing of a moment, in the space between what was said and what was not said, in the direction of a person's eyes when they thought they were not being watched. She saw him put the phone down. She understood what it meant. The waitress came back with coffee for Daniel and orange juice for Maya, and Maya drank half the juice in one long pull and felt it move through her like something medicinal. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her. He said, "How long?" She knew what he was asking. She said, 6 months. He said, "How old are you?" She said, 17. He was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone trying to figure out what to say. The quiet of someone actually thinking. She said, "You're going to ask what happened, and then I'm going to tell you, and you're going to say that's terrible, and then you're going to feel like you did something by listening. That's usually how it goes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Is that what you want me to do?" She said, "No." He said, "Okay." The soup came. She wrapped her hands around the bowl the same way he held his coffee, and the warmth moved up through her palms, and she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, he was still looking at the table, giving her that second. She had met hundreds of people in 6 months. Not one of them had given her a second. He said, "I slept in a parking garage when I was 23. She looked up. He said, "Not for a night. For 8 months." She said nothing. He said, "I'm not telling you that so you'll trust me. I'm telling you because it's true and most people in my life don't know it, and I've been tired of that for a long time." She studied him. The lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples. She was looking for the shape of what he was carrying, because everyone was carrying something, and the shape of it told you more than anything they said. His shape was familiar, not the details, the structure, the way a person holds themselves when they have been through something that rearranged them and had to build a version of normal on top of the wreckage. She recognized it because she was doing it herself, in real time, with poor materials and no instructions. The pancakes came. She ate slowly now. The first animal urgency had passed and she was eating like a person, tasting things. Daniel said, "What were you doing before?" She said, "Living with my aunt." He waited. She said, "She got sick. Not in the way that gets better, the kind that gets expensive and then gets worse." She broke a piece of pancake with her fork. I was helping. Then her daughter came back and there wasn't room, and there wasn't money, and I was the easiest problem to remove. She said it the way she always said it now, flat and clear, the same way you state a fact about weather or distance. The story had been carried so long it had worn smooth. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "You didn't do it." He said, "No, but I'm still sorry." She looked at him. People said "I'm sorry" all the time. It was filler, the conversational equivalent of background music, something to fill the silence that opened up when someone told you something heavy. But he said it differently. He said it the way people say things they actually mean, quietly, without extra weight on it, not performing grief but acknowledging hers. She said, "Where's the garage?" He said, "Which one?" She said, "The one you slept in." Something changed slightly in his face. He said, "Midtown. Demolished now. They built a hotel on it." He paused. "I drove past the hotel once. It felt strange." She said, "Did you go in?" He said no. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to drive past the place where you survived yourself and not be able to go in. She said, "The shelter I was using closed a side entrance they used to leave open at night. 3 weeks ago. I've been outside since." He said, "Where do you sleep?" She told him, not because she fully trusted him yet, but because she had made a calculation, the kind of fast, instinctive calculation that people in her situation make constantly, measuring risk against possibility. And the calculation had come out in his favor. He listened without interrupting. He did not say, "Oh my," or "how awful," or the things people said when they were listening, in order to respond rather than listening in order to understand. He just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to stay on the street?" She looked at him. He said, "I'm not asking what happened or what you deserve or any of that. I'm asking what you want." No one had asked her that. Not in 6 months. Not the shelter intake workers who asked a checklist of questions in tired voices. Not the volunteers who came on Saturdays with sandwiches and a practiced compassion. Not the school counselor she had tried to talk to, once, in a previous life, who had said all the right words and then done nothing because doing something was complicated. No one had asked Maya Reyes what she wanted. She said, "I want a room with a window." She had not planned to say that. It came out before she could shape it into something more practical. He said, "Okay." She said, "I don't need charity." He said, "I'm not offering charity." She said, "Then what are you offering?" He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. She could see him thinking. He said, I'm offering to help you remove some specific problems, one at a time. You decide which ones and when. She turned her fork over in her fingers. Outside the diner window, the city moved. A woman walked past, pushing a stroller. Two young men in delivery uniforms stood, sharing something from a phone, laughing. A dog on a leash looked in through the glass with calm, interested eyes. Maya said, What do you get out of it? He said, I don't know yet. She said, That's an honest answer. He said, I try. She drank the last of her orange juice. The diner was warm. Her feet were still cold. They had been cold for 3 weeks straight. But the rest of her was warm, and there was food in her stomach, and she was sitting across from a man who had said just Daniel on a sidewalk, and had put his phone face down, and had asked her what she wanted. She said, My mother used to make pad thai. It was the first voluntary thing she had offered, not an answer to a question, just something real, given freely. He said, Was it good? She said, It was the best thing I've ever eaten. She paused. She said, Until today. He smiled. It was a small smile, nothing dramatic, but it changed his whole face. It made him look like a person who had, at some point in his life, laughed very easily. She thought that this was someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side, and had never quite lost the warmth of it. The check came. He paid without looking at the total. Maya sat for a moment, her hands in her lap, the warmth of the diner around her like something she was not sure she deserved to feel. She said, What happens now? He said, I don't know exactly. He said it the same way he had said I'm sorry, without extra weight, without performance. She said, Will you actually do something, or is this the part where you feel good about yourself and then go back to your life? He looked at her. He said, I'm going to try very hard to make it the first one. She held that answer. She had a rule about promises. She did not trust them. She had learned that people's intentions were real, and their follow-through was not always, and the gap between the two was where people like her tended to fall. But he had not made a promise. He had said he would try. That was different. She nodded once. Outside, the sky above the buildings had turned the particular shade of dark blue that comes in the last few minutes before full night, the blue that is almost purple, the blue that means the day is genuinely done. She had made it through another one. But for the first time in a long time, that felt like the beginning of something rather than just the end. The next morning, Daniel was at his desk by 7. His assistant, a sharp young man named Owen, had reorganized the afternoon around the rescheduled 4:30 without a single complaint, which was one of the reasons Daniel paid him well and trusted him completely. Owen came in at 7:15 with coffee and a tablet showing the day's schedule and said, You had a visitor last night. Security noted it. Daniel said, It was me. I came back for something I left. He had gone back to the office at 9 p.m. the previous night. He had sat at his desk for 2 hours without opening his computer. He had thought about a girl on a sidewalk, asking for leftovers in the quietest voice he had heard in years. He had thought about a parking garage in Midtown that was now a hotel. He had thought about the version of himself that had slept in that garage, 23 years old, his savings gone, his first business idea in ruins, too proud to call home, and too scared to call it permanent. He had thought about the people who had walked past him on those mornings. There had been many. He did not blame them. He had done it himself. Once he was the one in the good suit. He had not done it yesterday. He opened his computer. He sent one email to a woman named Carol Sims, who ran a transitional housing program he had been donating to for 4 years. He had never called in a favor from Carol. He had simply written checks and received quarterly reports with photographs of women and girls who looked like they were on the edge of something new. The email said, I need to talk to you today, not as a donor, as someone who knows a specific person who needs a specific kind of help. Please call when you can. Carol called at 8:40. He told her about Maya. Not everything. He had not earned the right to tell someone else's full story, but enough. He told her about the sidewalk and the bench and the diner. He told her about the shelter that had closed the side entrance. He told her about the room with a window. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Daniel, you know this isn't how it works. There's a process. There's an intake assessment and a wait list. And, he said, I know. I also know you have the authority to move a case when you believe it's the right call. I'm asking you to believe it's the right call. Another pause. She said, She's 17? He said, Yes. She said, Bring her in this afternoon. He called the number he had taken from Maya the night before, a borrowed phone number, a friend of a friend, a two-step connection. He left a message. He sent a text through the number as well, which was all he could do. At noon, he got a single word back. Okay. He drove himself. He did not send a car. He went down to the garage under his building, got into his own car, and drove to the spot where he had been standing on the phone the previous afternoon. She was there. She was sitting in a different position, her back against a different section of the same wall, her backpack across her lap. She looked like she had not slept, which she later told him was correct. She got in the car without ceremony. She did not comment on the car, which was expensive, which everyone always commented on. She said, Where are we going? He said, A place I'd like you to see. You don't have to stay. You don't have to decide anything today. She looked out the window as they drove. She said nothing for several minutes. Then she said, You actually came back. He said, I said I would. She said, People say things. He said, I know. She said, Okay. Just okay. It was not forgiveness, or trust, or any of the large words. It was a small door, opened a crack, which was more than she had offered most people in 6 months, and he understood that. Carol met them at the door of the housing program's main building. She was a tall woman in her 60s, with the kind of calm that comes from 30 years of doing difficult work, and never once thinking about quitting. She shook Daniel's hand, and then looked at Maya and said, I hear you're looking for a room with a window. Maya looked at Daniel. He shrugged slightly. She looked back at Carol. She said, Yes. Carol said, Good. Come in and let me show you what we've got. The room was on the second floor. It had a window that faced east. In the mornings, Carol said, the light came in early, and it was a good light, a clean light. Maya stood at the window for a long moment. Outside there was a small yard with 2 trees that were just beginning to get their leaves back, the pale new green of early spring that is almost embarrassing in its hope. She said, I'd have to do an intake assessment. Carol said, Yes. It takes about an hour. She said, And there are rules. Carol said, Several. They're reasonable. You'll decide that yourself when you read them. Maya looked at the trees. She said, Okay. She moved in on a Tuesday. Daniel drove her. She had very little to move. A backpack, a plastic shopping bag with a few things she had managed to hold on to through everything, a library book she had borrowed 3 weeks earlier, and had been carrying with her ever since because returning it felt like giving up a piece of a life that still existed somewhere. The room was small. The bed had a blue cover. There was a desk and a chair and a window that faced east. She put the library book on the desk. She sat on the bed. She did not cry. She was not that kind of person, or she had stopped being that kind of person somewhere in the last 6 months. She was not sure which. Daniel stood in the doorway. He said, I'll let you get settled. Owen, my assistant, will send you my number. Text or call whenever you want. Or don't, if you'd rather not. No pressure either way. She said, Why are you doing this? He had known she would ask again. She had asked in the diner, and he had said, I don't know yet, which was true at the time. He thought about it now, standing in the doorway of a small room on the 2nd floor. He said, Because someone should have done it for me, and they didn't. And I always told myself, if I was ever in a position to do it for someone else, I would. She looked at him. She said, That's a better answer than yesterday. He said, I had more time to think. She almost smiled. He saw it. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. He said, I'll check in. Not too often. I don't want to be someone you feel you have to answer to. She said weakly. He said, Sorry? She said, Check in weekly. Not more. Not less. Weekly is right. He said, okay. She said, and just a message. You don't have to come. He said, okay. She said, okay. He left. She sat in the room for a long time after he left. The afternoon sun came in through the east-facing window at a low angle and put a warm stripe across the floor. She took off her shoes. Her feet, out of those shoes for the first time in more than a day, felt strange, like released things. She lay back on the bed with the blue cover. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about her mother's pad thai and about a parking garage that was now a hotel, and about a question she had nearly not asked, about a man who had put his phone face down and sat on concrete in a good suit and said just his first name like it was the only name he had. She thought about all of it. Then, for the first time in 6 months, in a room with a window, she slept. The first message came the following Tuesday. It was brief. How are you settling in? Not a question mark. She noticed that. He had written it without a question mark, which meant he was not demanding an answer, just sending a word in her direction, the way you might leave a light on for someone. She wrote back, fine. The east window is good. He wrote, good. That was the whole exchange. 43 characters total. It was, somehow, exactly right. The intake process at the housing program was more than an hour. It was 3 sessions over 2 weeks, with a woman named Diane who had a very direct way of asking difficult questions and an equally direct way of listening to the answers. Maya had expected to find the sessions tedious or invasive. She found them, instead, useful in the way that looking at a map is useful. Not because the map makes the journey easier, but because it shows you where you actually are. She knew where she was. She did not always know where she was going. That was what Diane helped with. Not the past, which was finished, but the near future, which was a shape she had not yet been able to make out clearly. What do you like? Diane asked in their second session. Maya said, I like cooking. When did you discover that? Diane said. Maya thought about it. She said, I was 10. My mother let me start helping in the kitchen. She said I had the hands for it. I didn't know what that meant then. What do you think it meant? Diane said. Maya said, I think it meant I was patient and precise, and I liked the way you could follow a process and get something real at the end of it. Diane wrote something down. Maya said, why are you writing that down? Diane said, because it's good. Outside the housing program, the city had not changed. It was the same city she had been invisible in for 6 months. She walked its streets now from a different position, and they looked different, not safer exactly, but more navigable, the way a room looks different once you know where the light switches are. She walked a great deal. It was a habit she had built during the months outside, moving to stay warm, moving to stay awake, moving because motion felt like agency when everything else had been taken. Now she walked because she liked it, because the city offered itself differently at different hours, and she was learning it the way you learn a piece of music, bar by bar. On one of those walks, 3 weeks after moving in, she passed a restaurant kitchen through an open service door. The door was open because it was a warm afternoon and the kitchen was hot, which kitchen doors always were. She stopped. She stood on the sidewalk and looked in. There were 4 people working, moving around each other in that particular way. Kitchen workers move, without looking, knowing where the other bodies are, the way musicians know where the next note is, instinctively, through repetition, and something beyond repetition. She stood there for a long time. A man came out with a bag of trash, saw her, and said, "Can I help you?" She said, "Sorry, I was just watching." He said, "You cook?" She said, "I used to. A little." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "We're not hiring." She said, "I know. I wasn't asking." She walked on. But she thought about it all evening. She mentioned it in the weekly message to Daniel. Not the restaurant, not the kitchen, just, "I've been thinking about cooking. Like maybe it's something I could do seriously." "I don't know." He wrote back the next morning. "Tell me more about that when you feel like it." She did not write more about it right away. She let the idea sit. That was something she had learned about herself, that she needed to hold things for a while before she understood what they were. 3 weeks later, she wrote, "There's a culinary apprenticeship program. I looked it up. It's 18 months. You work in a real kitchen 3 days a week and study 2 days a week. You come out with a certification." He wrote back, "How do you get in?" She wrote, "Application and an interview and a skills assessment. You have to have a reference from somewhere." He wrote, "Can Carol give you a reference?" She wrote, "I didn't think of that." He wrote, "Ask her." She asked Carol. Carol said yes immediately. Carol also told her that the program had a sliding scale fee based on income, and that for participants from transitional housing, the fee was often waived entirely. Maya had not known that. She applied. The application asked her to write 300 words about why she wanted to cook. She sat at the desk in her room, the east window bright behind her, and wrote it in one sitting. She did not talk about her mother right away. She talked about what cooking felt like, the specific pleasure of transformation, of taking raw things and applying knowledge and heat and time, and producing something that had not existed before. She talked about precision and patience. She talked about feeding people and what it meant, how it was one of the oldest ways human beings had of saying, "I see you. I thought about you. Here is something I made for you with my hands." She read it back. She deleted the last sentence and put it back again. She submitted it. The interview was on a Thursday morning. She wore the cleanest things she had. She arrived 8 minutes early and sat in the waiting room and did not look at her phone because she did not want to seem like she was looking for somewhere to put her nerves. The interviewer was a woman in her 40s named Paula, with short dark hair and the efficient manner of someone who had conducted many of these interviews and had learned to see past the surface of them very quickly. She asked Maya why she wanted to cook. Maya said what she had written in the application, but differently, with more of herself in it, because saying it out loud with another person in the room was different from writing it at a desk alone. Paula listened. She said, "Tell me about a dish you know well." Maya told her about her mother's pad thai. She described it from memory, the ingredients, the order of operations, the specific balance of sour and sweet and heat, the way the noodles had to be soaked to exactly the right softness before hitting the pan. Paula said, "That's very specific." Maya said, "Good cooking is very specific." Paula looked at her for a moment. The skills assessment was in a small kitchen at the back of the building. Maya was given a set of ingredients and 40 minutes and no further instruction. She made a simple seared chicken with a pan sauce and roasted vegetables. Nothing complicated. Nothing that required equipment she had not used. Clean flavors, precise execution, nothing out of place. When she came out, Paula was standing at the pass. Paula said, "You have good hands." Maya thought of her mother. She said, "I know." She got the acceptance letter 10 days later. She read it standing in her room, morning light coming through the east window, one of those moments where the room itself seems to be paying attention. She sent Daniel a message that said, "I got in." He wrote back, "I know." She wrote back, "How do you know?" He wrote, "Paula called Carol. Carol called me. I've been waiting for you to tell me." She looked at that message for a long time. She wrote, "You could have just told me." He wrote, "It wasn't mine to tell." She held the phone. She put it on the desk. She looked out the window at the 2 trees in the yard, which were full green now, summer having come in the weeks since she first stood in this room, and looked at their pale new leaves. She had asked for a room with a window. She had a room with a window. She was beginning to think that the things you ask for, even in a small voice on a sidewalk, even when no one seems to be listening, have a way of finding their shape, if you are patient enough, and precise enough, and willing to do the work. She was patient. She was precise. She was willing. The apprenticeship started on a Monday. She wore her good shoes, the ones Carol had helped her find at a second-hand store 2 weeks earlier. Good kitchen shoes with closed toes and thick soles. She arrived 10 minutes early. She walked into the kitchen. She thought, "This is where I begin." She had been right. 2 years is not a long time in the life of a city. The same building stood. The same glass tower reflected the same sky each morning, its surface showing the clouds moving, the birds passing, the light changing from pale to gold, to the sharp white of midday and back again. The sidewalk outside it saw thousands of people every week, the same river of shoes and briefcases and coat hems, nobody looking down. But for Maya Reyes, 2 years was the distance between one life and the beginning of another. It was not a clean distance. It did not happen the way things happen in stories that are trying too hard to make you feel a certain way at a certain moment. It happened the way real things happen, in pieces, with setbacks inside the progress, and progress inside the setbacks, with days that felt like nothing was moving, and then mornings where she woke up and could see, from where she stood, how far she had already come. She was 20 now. She had her own apartment, not a transitional room, not a borrowed space, but her own, paid for with her own wages, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building, 12 blocks from the restaurant where she worked. The apartment was small, and she had not put much in it yet, because she was saving, always saving. But the bedroom had a large window that faced east, and in the mornings the light came in clean and early, and she had learned to wake with it. She worked dinner service 4 nights a week, and weekend brunch 2 mornings a week, and she had been doing it long enough that the kitchen felt like the place her body understood best, the place where her hands knew what to do before her mind had finished deciding. The head chef, a tall, quiet man named Grant, had told her 6 months into her time there that she had a feel for seasoning that could not be taught, only recognized and used. She had written that down in a notebook she kept. She wrote a great deal in the notebook. Not a diary, not exactly, more a running conversation with herself about food and flavor, and what she was learning, and what she was trying. She had 4 notebooks full. She kept them on the shelf above the east window. The culinary apprenticeship had ended 8 months earlier, with a certification and a job offer from the same restaurant she had staged at in her final semester, which was the restaurant she was still working at, which was the restaurant she intended to work at for at least another year, before she applied to the management program she had been researching for 3 months. She had a plan. Having a plan was something she did not take lightly. There had been a time when a plan was a dangerous thing, because plans assumed a tomorrow that was not guaranteed, and she had learned during those 6 months to live in much smaller units of time. Now she could think in years. She held that capacity carefully, the way you hold a thing that is new and valuable and slightly astonishing. Daniel had checked in every week for 2 years. Not always messages, sometimes just a question mark, which she had come to understand as his version of a hand raised in passing, a signal that did not demand anything back but was simply present. She answered when she felt like it, which was most weeks, and did not when she did not, which was occasionally, and he had never once indicated that the silence bothered him. That was the thing about Daniel Holt that was hardest to explain to other people. He helped in a way that did not make her feel helped. He had connected her to Carol, and to Paula at the apprenticeship program, and once to a dentist who took her case on a sliding scale because he and Daniel had gone to school together, and Daniel had asked quietly and with no fanfare. He had never announced any of it. He had never introduced her to anyone as a person he had helped, or a project he was invested in, or any of the soft, well-meaning ways people sometimes turned kindness into a story about themselves. He was just Daniel. He just kept checking in. One Tuesday in late October, she was finishing a closing shift, the last table of the night cleared, the kitchen being broken down around her, the particular exhaustion of good work settling into her shoulders and the backs of her calves, when Grant put a phone down on the counter and said, "Have you seen this?" He turned the phone toward her. It was an article in a business publication, one of those long interviews with successful people that ran to several thousand words and took the subject seriously in ways that assumed the reader would find their thinking interesting. The subject was Daniel Holt. She picked up the phone. She read quickly at first, skimming the way she did with most things, and then slower when she reached the part that stopped her. He had been talking about decisions that had changed the trajectory of his thinking, not business decisions. The journalist had apparently pushed for something more personal, and he had given it, briefly, more briefly than the journalist probably wanted. He said he came back to a moment outside his office building, more than any board meeting or acquisition of the past several years. He described it without naming anyone. He said a young woman had asked him a question on a sidewalk, a simple question, the kind of question that should have been easy to answer, and that he had almost walked away from it. He said, I almost walked away. I've thought about that a great deal. The gap between what we almost do and what we actually do is where a lot of the important things live. Maya stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hands. The dishwasher was running. The exhaust fans were loud. Grant was wiping down the grill and pretending not to watch her read. She handed the phone back. She said, He's a good person. Grant said, Someone you know? She said, Yes. She said nothing more about it, and Grant did not ask, which was one of the reasons she liked working for him. She closed out and walked home through the October night, her jacket zipped to the collar, her breath visible in the cold air. 12 blocks. She walked them slowly, looking at the city the way she had been looking at it for 2 years now, with the specific attention of someone who had once been invisible in it, and had decided, consciously and with effort, to be present in it instead. She thought about the article all the way home. She sat on her couch for a while. She made tea. She stood at her east window and looked at the night sky, which was orange-tinted from the city lights, the way city skies always were. At 11:15, she called him. He picked up on the second ring. She said, You could have just walked past. There was a brief pause, the kind that meant he was placing her words exactly. He said, I almost did. She sat with that for a moment. She said, I read the article. He said, I figured you would eventually. She said, You didn't say my name. He said, I didn't have your permission. She thought about that. About a person who had $4.3 billion and 37 employees, and a personal assistant named Owen, and the kind of name that opened doors, having chosen, quietly, to protect her name, not to use it, not to put it in a story where it would belong to strangers. She said, Thank you. He said, You don't have to thank me for that. She said, I know. I'm thanking you anyway. She could hear the faint sound of something in the background on his end. Traffic, maybe. Or a television somewhere in a different room. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in a life she had never seen directly. She said, I'm applying to a management program next year. He said, I know. She said, Carol told you? He said, Owen found it. He found everything. I may have asked him to keep an eye on your career without telling you, which was probably overstepping. She said, It was a little overstepping. He said, I know. I'm sorry. She said, Don't do it again. He said, Okay. A pause. She said, But thank you. He laughed. It was a warm laugh. Brief. The laugh of someone who had been caught and was fine with it. She pulled her knees up on the couch. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the east window and the 2 trees that had been bare and then pale green and then full green and were now turning, their leaves going amber and copper in the autumn, the same trees she had looked at from the same window for 2 years. She said, Can I ask you something? He said, Yes. She said, Do you ever go back to the street where we met? He said, I walk past it every day. It's outside my building. She said, Do you think about it? He said, Every time. She said, What do you think about? He was quiet for a moment. He said, I think about how ordinary the moment was. You were sitting there. I had a bag of food. You said a quiet thing. I almost didn't hear it. She said, I almost didn't say it. He said, I know. She said, I'd been sitting there for a while, watching people. I kept thinking, not yet, not yet, like there was a right moment and I was waiting for it. He said, Was there a right moment? She said, I don't know. I just got tired of waiting. Another pause. The good kind. The kind where 2 people are comfortable with the space between words. She said, I'm glad you didn't walk past. He said, Me too, kid. Me too. She stayed on the couch for a while after they said goodbye, in her apartment with the east window and the 4 notebooks on the shelf, and the good kitchen shoes by the door. She thought about what it meant, the whole of it, the shape of the last 2 years. It was not a story about being saved. She had not been saved. She had been given a door, and she had walked through it herself, with her own feet, in shoes she had earned. It was not a story about a rich man and a poor girl. and a lesson that resolved cleanly at the end. It was a story about a question. It was a story about the enormous, invisible weight of saying something out loud when silence feels safer, when the voice in your head says, "Nobody is listening," when the world has spent months teaching you that you do not exist in ways it is willing to acknowledge. It was a story about what happens in the space between two people when one of them decides, for whatever reason, on whatever ordinary Tuesday afternoon, to make that space smaller. She had asked for leftovers on a sidewalk. She had been 17 and tired and precise about what she wanted and careful about who she was, even when the world was not being careful about her. She had said, "Excuse me," and the space, which had been glass and concrete and everything, had become, in the warmth of one unremarkable hour, nothing at all. She went to bed. She slept well. In the morning, the light came in through the east window, clean and early, and she woke with it the way she always did now, rising toward it as though it had been waiting for her specifically, as though it had been there all along, just on the other side of the glass, patient, steady, and entirely without conditions.